Good morning, colleagues and students, and it's a real pleasure to be here, and I want to just congratulate TUT for taking this step. I think I was at a similar meeting at Rhodes. In fact, Rasikan and I were together at Rhodes University a short while ago, and again, a very successful kind of engagement of this nature. And I think all of our universities have to go through this process. I mean, I think that, and I'll refer to that. Before I go on, I just want to add to the sentiments that were expressed earlier about the 40th anniversary of Steve Biko's passing away. And with a little anecdote, I grew up in a little town called Greytown, which is in the Midlands of KZN. In fact, there's a little smaller place called Sevenoaks, which is where my home is. But Greytown is where I went to school and all that. And when I was 16, I heard about this meeting that was taking place. Is anybody from Pietermaritzburg here? Yeah, you know the Lay Center at Edendale, right? Famous Lay Center. And I heard there was a meeting going on there, and so being 16 years old, and at that time you could hitchhike without telling my parents and so on. I hitchhiked to Pietermaritzburg from Greytown. It's about 45 minutes or something. Get to Lay Center, and 16 years old, and just sit quietly and trying to sort of find myself there, and then suddenly I see this person make a speech, and towering figure. I tell you, at that moment, that very moment, my life was transformed. I mean, at the age of 16, and everybody else speaks about what he said and what he doesn't, but very seldom do you hear about his physical presence and his ability to kind of really tower over, other people. And he's really an amazing person. But that moment, my life was transformed. Just to say, first of all, I think we have to thank, whether we like it or not, we must thank Fees Must Fall and Rhodes Must Fall. Because if it wasn't for Fees Must Fall, Rhodes Must Fall, we wouldn't be here today. And I think that they have raised, even though it was fucking irritating from time to time. I think that we have to accept that they've raised really important issues, and that issues that we can't avoid, issues that we have to deal with. And we might want to sit with them, with the students, and interpret what they are saying and so on, because it's not always totally clear what is being said and so on. And I think that there's a need for us to engage but I think we have to accept the fact that we are actually at a turning point in the history of universities in South Africa. I'm so pleased that I'm not a social scientist, because listening to Crane, it's just too complicated. I'm a physicist, so please expect a very simple kind of delivery from me. And Crane, by the way, I learned so much this morning, and thank you for that. But also from the VC and from Mr. Motsatsi, I want to thank you really for laying out a really good basis for today's discussion. Why are we here, right? We're here for just one reason, and that is that universities are not independent institutions. They are social institutions. They are created by a society to play a role. So there's a need for us from time to time to sit down and work out what is the role of a university. There's no God-given kind of definition of the roles that the universities must play. So there's a need for us to do, and that's exactly what we are doing now. And by the way, it's important for us to be pushed out of our comfort zones. And I want to thank Crane for doing that. I mean, he really did push us out of our comfort zones. And I think it's important for us to do that from time to time. So, and we have to just accept that universities are social institutions, but their business is knowledge. That is their business. Their business is the production of knowledge, the application of knowledge, and the dissemination of knowledge. By the way, the last one, dissemination, is the critical one, because there are many other kinds of institutions that produce knowledge and apply knowledge. I worked for a time at the CERN in Geneva, the big particle research center. Their business is not there. The business is not to disseminate knowledge. There, the business is production of knowledge. So there are other institutions that produce knowledge. But our role as universities is to work primarily as centers for the dissemination of knowledge. And dissemination not just in terms of our students, but dissemination in terms of the society. And I think the important point for us to remember in that is that we also work in the production of knowledge and in the application of knowledge, because those really enhance the dissemination of knowledge. So we have to think about those three. I shudder when I hear people say universities are basically research institutions. I don't agree with that. In fact, I disagree with that. Okay. So now we have to start, since these are social institutions, we have to start with what is around us. And we've heard already from various speakers. We have grinding poverty, notwithstanding the growth of the middle class, grinding poverty. We have growing inequality, grinding poverty and growing inequality. By the way, those two are different things, right? You have societies where people have a decent life, but where there's huge inequalities. But in South Africa, we have both. We have grinding poverty and we have growing inequality. So let's keep that in mind. Number two, we have a suffocating earth. Let's just be clear about that. If we want to be serious about the role of the university, we have to try to understand how to save the earth for our future generations. We have a suffocating earth. It is critically important for us to understand that there's a huge role for universities in understanding how to save the earth. We have enormous violence in our society. Kind of violence on people, violence on the earth, but violence at unprecedented scales. I mean, just, every day, you pick up the newspaper, you listen to the radio, and all you hear is levels of violence. There's ravaging political violence happening all over the world. We have this propensity as human beings, the easy propensity to other people, to say, they're not like us, they are other people. I keep asking myself, how was it possible for the Americans to drop those bombs on Iraq, in I don't know when it was, when George Bush was the only way they could do that is by a determination that those were not people living there in Baghdad. That's the only way they could have done that. There's no other way that, a society can take bombs and drop it on the people, knowing that there are people living there. The only way you can do that is if you come to a conclusion that those are not people. It's something else. So this propensity we have for creating the other is a critical challenge. By the way, we're seeing it in our own society now. We're seeing it all over our society. From time to time, we see attacks on non-nationals. We're seeing it in KZN in the political violence that's taking place there. It's happening in South Africa. Let's just be clear about that. Okay. And if you're watching the news now, just look at what's happening in Burma. This identification of a group of people because they are of a different religion, and the violence against them. We have a kind of mass migrations, as was referred to earlier, mass migrations all around the world. There are public health challenges which are of, unprecedented levels. I mean, let's just be clear, that we're not winning the war on HIV/AIDS. We are not winning the war. People are living longer because they're getting drugs, but actually the infection rate isn't dropping. Even today. There are vast changes that are taking place in the world of work. And that's something that we have to focus in on. I'm just very pleased to say that at its last board meeting, USAF decided that we're going to create a new strategy group, that's going to be looking at the future of work. Because there's such, just a simple example. Why is it that we have a 40-hour working week, right? That's something that just comes from out of the Industrial Revolution. That's going to change. You can bet your last penny. Just get your head around this, right? 20 years from now, there'll be very few cars that are driven by human beings, okay? Get your head around that. There won't be doctors, by the way. When you get sick, you won't go to a doctor. You'll go to a machine. Yeah, diagnosis is done by machines. I'm not saying that we won't have doctors, but a lot of the stuff that's currently done by human beings won't be done by human beings. The question then is, what are the implications of that, right? Okay. Now, and of course, as was referred to earlier, the whole issue around ethics, we live in one of the most unethical societies in the world. We have to, as universities, respond to that. Not just by critique, but by trying to understand how to build a cultures of strong ethics and so on. And let's be clear, that we are still a very fractured society. Every now and then, we just see these wild tweets that are going out and Facebook posts and so on. But, while we might say, oh, that's just sort of individuals who are behaving badly and so on, that's a reflection of a society that's still very fractured. By the way, we have to also give ourselves a tap on the back, because we were on the edge of the abyss of civil war in the late 80s and early 90s. We pulled out of that. And we've had relative political peace in South Africa, relatively speaking. But we are still a very fractured society. And we have to come to grips with that. And finally, we have to try to understand that we are on the slide to great anti-intellectualism. By the way, this is not just South Africa. It's very prevalent in South Africa. But it's not just South Africa. It's all over the world. All you have to do is look at Donald Trump, right? President of the wealthiest country in the world. I mean, that man is as anti-intellectual as you can imagine. I think we have to just focus in on that to some extent. Because what it does mean is that there's something going on in our universities which is not addressing this big question. I mean, how is it that the best universities in the US are producing people like Donald Trump? There's something fundamentally wrong there. So it's really important for us to sit back and ask ourselves, just what is going on? How and why is this happening? So if we look at those, and of course there are other issues, but if we look at those issues, I want to make 3 points. First of all of them have human beings at the center. They're all about human beings. They're all about what we are doing and what is being done to us. Human beings at the center. Second thing is that all of them are intensely local and intensely global, simultaneously. Every single one of those things is both a local problem and a global problem. And the third thing is that all of them really require a serious knowledge projects to address them. Okay? And that's why it's important for us to have a conversation about the role of universities as we head into the future. So I want to then change tack a little bit and say, well, what does a transformed university or a transforming university have to focus on? Okay? And I'm just going to go through a few things. The first thing I want to say is that universities must begin to place human beings at the center of their enterprise. The idea has to be that whatever we do at the universities, that it's about improving quality of life, improving quality of engagement, improving the capacity of human beings to... Now, universities can't solve all these problems, by the way, but we are social institutions, and we have a role to play. It must place the earth at its center of its design. In fact, we can no longer just sit back and say, we're going to work with an industry which is a dirty industry. We have to begin to say, what are the implications of the work that we are doing for future sustainability? The Vice-Chancellor raised the question, can we talk about sustainability as a centerpiece? It's a very good idea, I think, for you to think about. And as I mentioned earlier, the university, a transforming university, has to be intensely local and intensely global at the same time. It can't be, we can't just look inwardly and imagine that we can build a wall around ourselves. And we can't be just globally connected and imagine that we're a university that's of this society. So we have to be intensely local and intensely global. By the way, if you want to define a South African university, the one way I would define it is to say that a South African university takes the responsibility of producing knowledge about its own context and then taking that knowledge into the global terrain. You know, if there's time later, I'll describe a couple of examples of this, of how this works. But that's what will make our universities South African universities. Being locally connected, but ensuring that we are playing in that global knowledge terrain. And largely because so many of those problems that we are facing aren't just South African problems. They aren't just local problems. They're local and global simultaneously. Okay, here's something which I want to say, which might be slightly contentious, but not as contentious as what Crane was saying. I think that universities have to deliberately, by design, create meshes between themselves and their communities. When I say communities, I don't just mean communities that are around them. Okay, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But for example, universities have to create meshes between themselves and their students. You know, universities can't just simply say, okay, this is what we are offering. Students come to the university and connect with what we've got. You know, from day one, that's a recipe for failure. You have to start out by saying, who are our students? What do they come with? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? What are their financial conditions? And then design the university so that it encompasses those realities. Too many of our universities are waiting for another student, some student that doesn't exist, some student that used to come to the university before. That's changed. We have to focus in on the students we have. There are no other students, by the way. There are no students waiting out there who are somehow not coming to university. You know, the students TUT has are the students you have. There are no other students. So design the university around your students. You have to design the university around the staff, because at the end of the day, the staff is really the engine of the university. You have to design the university. By the way, you know, from my point of view at least, the most important thing for staff is to say, how do you create the conditions for academic staff to do the work in the best possible environment? That for me is a critical issue. And I think that there's a need to focus in on that and to address that issue. And then to create these meshes between the university and its communities, local industry, local government, regional government, communities around the university, and so on. It's really important for us to try to understand, you know, how to ensure that the university is seen by all of these communities as being open to engagement. You know, creating porous boundaries between the university and those communities. Trying to ensure that, you know, that universities are seen to belong to those communities. Local industry should see TUT as kind of a place to go to. Just a very little anecdote. I was once visiting the president of Michigan State University. And while I was having this discussion with him, his secretary comes in and says, there's a call for you. It turns out that it was the mayor of Detroit, and he had just heard that Ford was closing down one of its plants. The first call that the mayor makes, the first call, is to the president of the local university. See, there's a recognition there that actually the place to go to if you want help, if you want to if there's a big challenge, the place to go to with all its resources is the local university. So creating these meshes between those different communities and the university seems to me to be a critical issue. And finally, let's just remind ourselves, that universities are the most fantastic bridges between our society and other societies. We have to build those bridges. We have to ensure that there's a constant flow of people and a constant flow of knowledge between this transforming university and the universities and communities outside. We are a bridge. Our universities are bridges to these global communities. Okay, so what does TUT have to do? Vice Chancellor, I've got a few things that I want to say. First one is, I think that you have to shape your own knowledge project. You have to be careful, I think, not to be drawn into knowledge projects that are shaped somewhere else. I think when we talk about decolonization, it's not just external decolonization. It's not just about saying, we mustn't do what the Americans are telling us, or we mustn't do what the Chinese are telling us. We must also be careful about internal colonialism. We must also be saying, how do we shape a knowledge project which is independent? Because that's what will make you special. That's what will make you an institution that speaks to your realities, a reality that's really embedded in the context in which you find yourself. Okay. The second thing, I think that you have to think about significant signature projects. Actually, it's Mark Hay that asked me to repeat this, so I'm going to repeat it. You see, when Verwoerd said that, actually, black South Africans don't need mathematics, right? Actually, what he was doing basically was saying, well, the context is black people are going to be gardeners, so they're going to be working in the kitchens. Why do they need mathematics? Okay. In 1994, what we should have done is, we should have said, from today onwards, every young South African, irrespective of who they are and where they are, will study mathematics up to grade 12. By the way, there's nothing special about this. If you go to China, that's the case. If you go to Japan, that's the case. If you go to Norway, that's the case. Why is it not the case in South Africa? It's because we've adopted the colonial construct, right? We have not decolonized. So the big issue for us really is to say, as universities, how do we begin to engage with the schools around us and our schools of education to try to understand how we get all of our young people into mathematics? And by the way, it's not so much about, I'm a physicist, right? So I'm not suggesting that we do this because, it'll be good for science and it'll be good for building a STEM system in South Africa. Of course, that's true. But the reason it's important is because it'll be a genuine post-colonial statement. It'll be a genuine statement which takes us beyond apartheid. And we haven't done that. In fact, what we did was just the opposite. We said, young people don't need mathematics. That's what we've said. Okay. Next one. So I think that you have to think about a few signature projects that would be, and which have a genuine, I'm using this word decolonization, but I'm using it in a process sense rather than as a definitional sense. Okay, I would see the importance of a place like TUT, for a place like TUT, the issue of building this theory-praxis nexus as being really important, because Crane referred to this importance for us to focus in on this issue of problem solving. I think it's not enough for us just to have our students do theoretical work. That it's really important to create the opportunity for students to engage places of work. This idea that you create a nexus between theory and praxis. It's critically important because it opens up different avenues of functionality in the brain. The next one I want to say is we have to focus in on what the world of work looks like 20 years from now. And there's a whole conversation about that. And I think that you might want to sometime set up a 2-day workshop just on that, I think. But it's critically important that we are that as we design our curricula now, that we are taking into account that the young people that we are training now are not going to be working just next year and the following year, but they're going to be working 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 20 years from now. And I think we have to be really careful as a society, as South Africa, that we don't find ourselves completely sidelined out of this fourth industrial revolution again, that we are right in the middle of it, that we have the capacity to be in the middle of it. Big challenge we face is the issue of languages. I don't think it's possible for us to say simply that everything is going to be in English. I think that we have to begin to try to understand how we begin to integrate our own languages into the functioning of the universities. It's a huge challenge, but I think we have to move in that direction. We have to create a new generation of intellectuals. See, when I look at the people who came out of the 60s, 70s, 80s, the universities, in the 60s and 70s in particular, you have to just stand back and be deeply proud of what came out of that. Our transition in 1994 didn't happen by magic. It happened through the intervention of these generations of huge intellectuals. And we've let that slide. We have to go back and we have to ask ourselves, how do we create a new generations of intellectuals? How do we begin to build again this culture that South Africa does have at its heart, this deep commitment to intellectualism? I want to just give you a little anecdote again. I had a physics visitor friend from India who came and he visited some friends of ours, some common friends of ours, and he came home and he said to me, what a strange home. So he's a friend of mine. So I said, what do you mean? So he said, not a single book in the house. Now that might sound strange, right? But actually what he was really talking about was, here's a family, all educated, but no idea that children need to be brought up in an environment where there's ideas and books and all that, Anyway, just a thought. Another issue, I think that all of our universities, irrespective of which one it is, whether it's University of Cape Town or TUT, we have to adopt a deeply embedded social justice agenda. We can't just sit back and say, you know what, our students are poor, that's not our problem. Or, the communities around us are poor, that's not our problem. We have to adopt a strong social justice agenda. We have to really think hard about how the university can bring its resources to bear on addressing these deep social justice issues that we have. By the way, the importance of this is not that you're going to solve the problems, because you're not going to solve the problems. The importance of this is that you create a social justice environment, a social justice paradigm, a social justice kind of philosophy that begins to be inculcated in your students and staff. And I love that statement there, and I want to put it in a slightly different way. I think that TUT and its internal communities have to be both subject and object of transformation. You can't transform the institution unless the individuals are transformed. What that means is that you have to engage, you have to go through introspection, retrospection. You have to go through processes that allow you to become transformed human beings. Because if you're not a transformed human being, then in fact, you're not going to see a transformed institution. Mahatma Gandhi once said, and I don't think this is an exact quote, but it goes something like this: "If we must be the change we want to see in the world." Like, you can't imagine a change and say that would be nice to have, but actually don't go through a process of change yourself, that kind of change. We used to speak about our struggle in 1994, and Mr. Motsatsi, now you've just hit it on the head about how we've deviated from this, But in 1990, before 1994, we always thought of the struggle as the prophet of the future. We thought of it as we had to engage in the struggle in such a way that it gave us and it gave the people we worked with an idea of what the future would look like. But what that means is that you have to go through a process of change yourself. Okay. Right, I think that brings me to the end, and I just want to say that the question that was asked by the Vice-Chancellor was, Quo vadis TUT? And I think there can be just one answer to that, Phambili TUT. So, thank you.